In every ancient house there are places where time seems to hold its breath, silent corners, dust-covered shelves, and forgotten drawers where the lives of those who once walked the halls linger in fragments too small to be noticed by ordinary eyes. In one such corner, in a centuries-old library that belonged to a family whose name carried weight and history, a secret waited, quiet, patient, and filled with the fragile hope of someone who had lived far away from privilege, yet close to the fire of dreams. The library itself was not an ordinary room. It was built at a time when books were treasures rarer than jewels, when each volume carried the scent of ink and parchment and bore the weight of hands that believed words could outlast even stone. The shelves stretched to the ceiling, so high that one needed a ladder on rails to reach the uppermost titles. Velvet curtains framed tall windows, but the glass was often dim with dust, allowing only a shy glow to seep through. In the evenings, when the lamps were lit, shadows would dance across the walls like figures from forgotten tales. And it was there, between the cracks of history and silence, that a young heir stumbled upon something that would alter the course of his life. He had grown up surrounded by wealth and the silent expectation of carrying on the family name. To many, his life appeared enviable: tailored suits, elegant soirees, and endless opportunities already paved before him. Yet, beneath the polished surface, he often felt the weight of emptiness. The grand halls of the mansion echoed too loudly, and even the laughter at gatherings seemed rehearsed. What truly fascinated him was not the world of business or status, but stories. The lives etched in ink, the voices of strangers who had long ago lived, loved, and left their words behind. The library became his refuge, the one place where he could escape the rigid molds of duty and breathe in the freedom of imagination. It was on an afternoon heavy with rain that the discovery occurred. The windows rattled under the storm's force, and the scent of damp earth seeped into the room. He had been reaching for a book on the top shelf, one he barely remembered seeing before. As he tugged at it, a thin envelope slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor like a bird startled from its nest. Intrigued, he bent down and picked it up. The paper was yellowed, its edges frayed, yet the handwriting on the front, delicate, almost trembling, was still clear. It was not addressed to anyone by name, but instead carried a single line: "To whoever believes in dreams." The words struck him with an unexpected force. They seemed almost alive, as if they had waited all these years for the right eyes to read them. He hesitated before opening it, the crackle of the old paper echoing in the silence. Inside, the letter was written in a hand both elegant and urgent. The ink faded in places, but still legible. It began not with a greeting, but with a confession. "I do not know if these words will ever be read. I hide them here, in a place I may never return to, because dreams have to live somewhere, even if they cannot live in me." The heir's heart quickened as he read. The letter belonged to a young woman who spoke of her longing to become a writer, of stories she carried inside her but could not share with the world. She wrote of nights spent by a candle, scribbling lines that no one would ever read, and of the crushing weight of poverty that forced her to choose between bread and ink. Yet in every line, there was no bitterness, only a fragile flame of hope. She wrote of her wish that one day someone would find her words and believe in them enough to give them life. The letter ended with a plea, almost a whisper. "If you are reading this, please remember me not as someone who failed, but as someone who loved stories too much to let them die with her silence." When he finished, he sat motionless, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside, the storm roared on, but within him another storm had begun. Who was she? How had her words ended up here, hidden in the very heart of his family's library? Had she once walked these halls, her footsteps lost in time? Or had someone, out of kindness, preserved her letter within a book, hoping that fate would one day place it in the right hands? He read the letter again, slower this time, as though savoring every word. Each sentence carried the warmth of someone who had lived with very little, yet had dreamed with an abundance no wealth could buy. The more he read, the clearer it became. This was not just a fragment of the past. It was a call, a thread stretching across time, reaching for someone who might be willing to hold it. And in that moment, the heir felt something shift within him. His life had always been mapped out by others, yet here was a path that seemed to beckon him alone. not one of duty or expectation, but of curiosity, compassion, and perhaps destiny. He folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and slipped it into his pocket as though it were a treasure far more valuable than any jewel in the house. That night, long after the lamps had been extinguished and silence had returned to the mansion, he lay awake with the letter resting on his chest. He could not escape the thought of her, the unknown writer who had lived in hardship yet dared to dream. Her words haunted him, not with sorrow but with a strange, undeniable pull. He needed to know more. He needed to find her, or at least her story. For deep down, he sensed that whoever she was, her fate had somehow become entwined with his own. Thus began a journey not just through old archives and whispered rumors, but through the corridors of his own heart. For what he had found was more than a forgotten letter. It was a voice that refused to be silenced, a promise hidden in ink, waiting to be fulfilled. And as the heir drifted into restless sleep, he realized that this discovery was not the end of a story left behind. It was the beginning of his own. The days that followed the discovery of the letter were unlike any the young heir had ever known. Before, his routines were guided by the rhythm of formality, mornings filled with obligations, afternoons consumed by carefully arranged meetings, and evenings spent in gilded salons where conversation sparkled but carried no warmth. Yet now, every moment seemed to pulse with a secret undercurrent. The letter, folded neatly and always close at hand, had become the axis around which his thoughts revolved. He would slip away from gatherings earlier than expected, claiming fatigue, though in truth he wished only to be alone with the words. He read them again and again, tracing the curves of each letter, imagining the hand that had written them. Sometimes he whispered the sentences aloud, as if to hear her voice carried through the years. The mansion, once a silent cage, now felt alive with the echo of an unseen presence. His curiosity grew restless, like a flame too large for its lantern. Who was she? The library was filled with volumes collected over generations, many of them acquired at auctions, estates, or gifted by friends of the family. Could the letter have come from one of those? Or had she herself once stood in the library, tucking the envelope between the pages in a moment of desperation or hope? The possibilities gnawed at him. He began to investigate. Quietly, without announcing his intentions, he retraced the history of the book from which the letter had fallen. It was an old collection of poetry, bound in worn leather, its spine creased from use. Inside the cover, a name had been scribbled in faint ink, though the years had blurred the letters until they were almost indecipherable. He held it up to the light, tilting it this way and that, until at last he could make out a single initial, an E, followed by what might have been the start of another letter, though it trailed off into obscurity. The mystery deepened. That faint mark, that incomplete signature only added to the letter's allure. He could have dismissed it, chalked it up to coincidence, but he found himself incapable of doing so. Something within him whispered that her story had not ended with the note, that perhaps hidden among the dust of records and memories, fragments of her life could still be found. He began asking subtle questions. At breakfast, he inquired casually with the butler, an elderly man who had served the family for decades. "Do you recall," he asked, pretending nonchalance, "anyone from years past who might have left writings behind in the library? Perhaps a guest who admired the books?" The butler paused, thoughtful, then shook his head. "Many have passed through these halls, sir. Scholars, poets, even young women who admired the grandeur of the house, but nothing that I would recall as unusual." Still, the heir pressed on. He visited the family archives, a cold chamber in the basement where old contracts, letters, and deeds were stored in rows of locked cabinets. He spent hours poring over faded handwriting, hoping for a match, a clue, something that tied the unknown writer to his family's history. Yet each evening he emerged with nothing but weary eyes and ink-stained fingers. And still, his determination only grew stronger. It was not only the mystery that drove him. There was something more, something tender and unspoken. In her words, he had felt a vulnerability that resonated deeply within him. He imagined her sitting at a small desk, candlelight flickering against thin walls, her pen scratching across paper, even as hunger gnawed at her stomach. She had no riches, no audience, yet she had the courage to believe in her voice. In her humility, he saw a strength he himself lacked. For though he had everything, he had never known what it was to dream with such desperation. At night, he would stare at the ceiling of his grand chamber, listening to the silence. Around him luxury lay heavy, the carved wood of the bed frame, the silken sheets, the gilded mirrors. Yet all of it felt hollow compared to the single piece of paper tucked safely in his drawer. He thought of her words, "Dreams have to live somewhere, even if they cannot live in me." And he wondered, had her dreams died with her? Or had they survived, waiting for someone like him to breathe life into them? It was then that his curiosity transformed into resolve. He would not rest until he discovered her identity, until he knew whether her words had been lost to time or whether traces of her still remained. He began to imagine what it might be like if he did find her, or her descendants, or her work hidden away somewhere. Could he honor her wish, to let her voice be heard, to publish the stories she had once only dared to write in secret? His search became the hidden rhythm of his life. He began visiting bookstores, especially those that carried second-hand and rare volumes. He would linger for hours, scanning shelves for anything that carried her hand, her voice, her initials. He spoke to old booksellers, asking if they had ever come across writings by a woman who had gone unnoticed, unpublished, yet had left behind traces of genius. Most shook their heads, but some leaned in, intrigued by his persistence, promising to look through their collections more carefully. One evening, in a small, dimly lit shop that smelled of dust and leather, he held a book that bore a handwritten dedication inside. "To all the words I never had the courage to release." Though unsigned, the sentiment mirrored her letter so closely that his heart pounded. Could it be hers? The shopkeeper shrugged when asked about its origins. "It came from a box at an estate sale years ago," he said. "No name, no record." Though it offered no concrete answers, it was enough to fuel the heir's determination. His curiosity soon became a secret obsession. He carried the letter with him wherever he went, tucked inside his coat like a hidden heartbeat. At gatherings, while others laughed and sipped champagne, he would slip away, pulling the letter out in quiet corners, tracing the ink with his fingertips. To his friends he seemed distracted, distant. To his family he seemed irresponsible, wasting his time on pursuits unworthy of his station. But he could not explain to them that he was no longer content with shallow conversations and glittering halls. He was chasing something real, something raw, something that had already begun to change him. And yet, even as he searched tirelessly, a part of him began to fear. What if he never found her? What if the letter was the only piece of her that remained, her voice destined to live only in those few fragile lines? The thought haunted him, but rather than discouraging him, it pushed him forward. For if her words had survived long enough to reach him, then surely fate intended for the rest of her story to be uncovered. The heir's curiosity was no longer a fleeting whim. It was a promise he had made silently to her, to himself, to the very essence of what it meant to dream. And though he could not yet know it, his search would lead him far beyond dusty books and forgotten archives. It would lead him to a doorway where two worlds, one of wealth and one of struggle, would meet, and where the fragile ink of a hidden letter would blossom into the bold strokes of love. Far from the grand halls and towering shelves of the heir's mansion, life pulsed in a very different rhythm. On a narrow street where the cobblestones were uneven and the lamps flickered with more hesitation than certainty, a small room overlooked the world with humble defiance. Its window was cracked, its curtains thin and its furniture sparse, yet inside lived a young woman whose dreams reached farther than the tallest towers, whose spirit soared higher than any gilded ceiling could contain. She was a writer, or at least she longed to be one. In truth, the world knew her only as a girl who lived quietly, who took small jobs to keep herself fed, who often walked with her eyes lowered as though she carried a secret, too precious to share. But within her, stories roared. They filled her nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. They accompanied her footsteps as she hurried through the city streets. She saw them in the shadows that clung to alleyways, in the laughter of children chasing each other through the square, in the weary sighs of workers returning home after long days. Every detail of life was a fragment of a tale waiting to be told. Her desk was little more than a wooden table, its surface uneven and scarred. Yet to her it was sacred ground. Upon it, scraps of paper piled up, some torn from old notebooks, others gathered from discarded ledgers she had salvaged. Ink stains marked her fingertips, a quiet badge of her devotion. Many nights when the city had gone to sleep, she lit a single candle and bent over her pages, pouring her soul into words. The flame flickered, casting shadows on the walls, as if the room itself were leaning closer to listen. But dreaming came at a price. Her world was not one of luxury, but of constant compromise. Sometimes she skipped meals to buy ink. Sometimes she mended her worn dress instead of replacing it, so she could save for paper. She lived in a state of quiet sacrifice, one that few around her understood. To many, her pursuit seemed foolish. "What good are stories?" neighbors would say with pity in their voices. "Words cannot fill your stomach. Dreams cannot pay your rent." And though their words stung, she never let them see her tears. She would smile politely, return to her room, and write anyway. Because to her, writing was not a choice. It was the very essence of who she was. Without it, the world dulled. Without it, her heart felt hollow. She had once tried to abandon it, to live only in the practicality of survival. But those were the darkest days of her life, days when even the sunlight seemed heavy. She learned then that dreams, no matter how impossible, could not be buried without burying oneself along with them. And so she wrote, knowing her words might never escape the confines of her room. She dreamed of publication, of holding a bound copy of her book in her hands, of seeing her name printed across a cover. But publishers required connections, money, influence, things she had never possessed. On rare occasions when she dared to send out her manuscripts, they were returned with polite rejections, or worse, with silence. Yet even these failures did not extinguish her determination. If anything, they fueled it. For every no, she wrote another story, believing that one day, perhaps long after she was gone, someone might stumble upon her words and recognize the soul she had poured into them. It was during one of those nights of candlelit scribbling that she penned the letter, the very one the heir would one day discover. She had written it in a moment of despair, her stomach empty, her body weak, yet her heart burning too fiercely to be silenced. She had hidden it not in her own home, but in a place she had once visited, the grand library where she had briefly worked as a temporary assistant, dusting shelves and arranging books. She remembered standing in awe of the wealth around her, the polished wood and endless rows of knowledge, while she herself could barely afford a single volume. It was there, in a quiet moment, that she had slipped her letter between the pages of a book, a secret prayer left behind for destiny to answer. She had never returned to that library. Life had pulled her in different directions, harder ones, lonelier ones. And yet, as the years passed, she often thought of that hidden note. It gave her a strange kind of comfort to know that somewhere in the world, a fragment of her truest self was preserved, waiting for someone to find it. She never expected that anyone actually would. But it allowed her to believe that her dream, fragile though it was, had not been buried entirely. Her silent dream carried her through countless hardships. When her landlord knocked impatiently at her door, demanding rent she barely had, she clutched her manuscripts and whispered to herself, "One day, these will matter." When hunger twisted her stomach, she reminded herself that words could nourish the soul, even if the body ached. When loneliness crept in like a cold wind, she found companionship in the characters she created, in the lives she conjured on paper. She walked the city streets with a notebook always tucked in her satchel. Inspiration struck in the most unlikely places, in the way rain pooled in the cracks of the pavement, in the fleeting glance between two strangers, in the stray cat curling up on a doorstep. She collected these fragments like jewels, weaving them into stories that reflected not just her world, but the beauty she insisted still existed within it. Yet for all her hope, doubt was a constant shadow. Sometimes, as dawn broke and the candle burned out, she stared at her words and wondered if they were enough. Were her stories truly worth telling, or was she clinging to an illusion, a dream destined to fade with her? In those moments, she would close her eyes and press her hand to her heart, listening to its steady rhythm, and she would whisper, Even if no one ever reads them, they are mine. And that is enough. Still deep down, she longed for more. She longed for someone, anyone, to see her, to recognize the fire in her soul. Not for fame, not for wealth, but simply for the validation that her voice mattered. Her silent dream was both her greatest strength and her most vulnerable wound. What she could not have known was that her words, tucked away in the forgotten corner of a library, had already begun to weave their way into another life. That somewhere, in a mansion far removed from her modest room, a young heir was holding her letter with trembling hands, feeling his own world shift because of her. That her silent dream, carried in ink and hope, had reached farther than she had ever dared to imagine. And soon the two threads, hers of struggle and hope, his of privilege and yearning, would begin to intertwine. For the dream she thought no one would ever hear had awakened curiosity in the heart of someone who would not stop until he found her. And in that collision of worlds, the silence of her dream would at last find its echo. The young heir's search had become more than an idle curiosity. It had transformed into a quiet obsession, one that pulled him out of the polished comfort of his family's estate and into streets he had never truly walked before. For weeks he had followed faint traces, half-remembered records, whispered accounts from old booksellers, and fragments of signatures that teased him with possibility. Each dead end only deepened his determination. He was no longer merely seeking a name. He was seeking the heart that had bled into the letter he now carried everywhere, pressed against his chest like a secret heartbeat. And then, one winter afternoon, when the air was sharp and the city seemed hushed under a gray sky, fate did what persistence alone could not. It brought their worlds together. He had been wandering down a narrow street, lined with second-hand shops, his coat pulled tightly against the cold. The kind of place where shutters rattled in the wind, where people hurried past with scarves wrapped up to their eyes. A small bookstore sat at the corner, its windows fogged, a handwritten sign promising rare finds and forgotten treasures. He had been in shops like it before, but something about this one drew him in, as though invisible threads were tugging him through its door. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as he stepped inside. Warmth enveloped him, along with the scent of aged paper and ink. Shelves leaned under the weight of old volumes, and stacks of unbound manuscripts lay on tables, waiting for curious hands. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper nodded in greeting, then returned to cataloguing a pile of books. The heir removed his gloves slowly, scanning the shelves with restless eyes. And then he saw her. She was seated at a small table near the window, her notebook open before her, a pen in hand. Her hair fell loosely around her face, and her clothes, though plain and worn, carried a quiet grace. She was scribbling furiously, so absorbed in her writing that she seemed oblivious to the world around her. Customers moved in and out, the shopkeeper shuffled about, but she remained anchored in her own universe, her pen the only compass she needed. The air froze. Something about her presence struck him like recognition, not of her face, which he had never seen before, but of her essence. It was the same pulse he had felt when reading the letter, the same quiet fire. Without meaning to, he stepped closer, the creak of the floorboards announcing his approach. She looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his, and in that instant, the world seemed to still. Her gaze was not timid, though it carried the weariness of someone accustomed to being overlooked. It was steady, searching, almost as though she were asking him why he was there, intruding upon her moment of solitude. He felt the weight of her eyes more than any audience he had ever stood before. He wanted to speak, but for once words deserted him. He cleared his throat softly. I'm sorry, he managed, his voice quieter than he intended. I didn't mean to disturb you. She tilted her head slightly, her expression guarded but curious. You're not disturbing me, she said, her tone calm, though there was a note of caution in it, as though life had taught her to keep strangers at a measured distance. He hesitated, his heart racing. Should he ask her outright? Should he reveal the letter he carried, the secret that had consumed him? No, not yet. To thrust it upon her now would feel reckless, even invasive. Instead, he gestured lightly toward her notebook. You're writing. A faint smile tugged at her lips, though it was tinged with self-consciousness. "I try," she replied. "It's what I love, even if it doesn't always love me back." The words struck him. They carried the same bittersweet tone as the letter, the same blend of hope and quiet sorrow. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain composed. "What do you write?" he asked gently. "Stories," she said, her eyes flickering down to the pages as if they might shield her from judgment. "Mostly ones that no one will ever read." He felt the air shift between them, a silence rich with unspoken truths. Part of him wanted to say, "I've already read your words, they changed me." But instead he simply said, "Maybe one day they will." Her expression softened, though her skepticism lingered. "That would be a dream," she murmured. The shopkeeper called from behind the counter, breaking the moment, and she glanced away. The heir, sensing her retreat, stepped back slightly. But inside his heart was alight. He did not yet know with certainty that she was the one who had written the letter, but everything within him told him she was. Her presence, her words, the very air around her. It was as though the ink of that letter had taken form before him. Over the next days he found excuses to return to the shop. Sometimes he pretended to browse, sometimes he bought a book he did not need. Always his eyes searched for her. And more often than not, she was there, her notebook open, her pen moving across the page with quiet determination. Slowly, cautiously, he began to speak with her more. Their conversations were small at first, about the weather, about books, about the strange comfort of being surrounded by stories. But each exchange left him hungry for more. He learned that she lived nearby in a modest room where the walls were thin and the rent unforgiving. She did odd jobs to make ends meet, sometimes helping the shopkeeper organize his stock, sometimes delivering parcels. She did not complain, but he could sense the weight of her struggles in the pauses between her words. And yet, even in hardship, there was a quiet dignity in her, a fire that poverty could not extinguish. She, in turn, learned little about him, at least not the truth. He introduced himself only by his first name, avoiding any mention of his family's wealth or status. He wanted her to see him not as an heir to fortune, but as a man, drawn to her words and her spirit. He longed for her to trust him without the veil of titles or inheritance. One evening, as the shop emptied and the lamps flickered low, he gathered the courage to ask, "Do you ever share your stories with others?" She shook her head softly, her smile tinged with sadness. "They're not meant for this world, I think, or maybe the world isn't meant for them." "Then let me be the exception," he said before he could stop himself. His voice was earnest, almost pleading. "Let me read them." Her eyes widened, surprise flashing across her face. For a moment, she studied him as though searching for hidden motives. Then, slowly, she slid a single page across the table. Her handwriting flowed across the paper, delicate yet strong. He read the lines quickly, hungrily, and with each word his conviction deepened. This was her. The letter, the voice that had called to him from the library. It was here, alive in her. When he looked up, his eyes met hers, and though neither spoke the truth aloud, both seemed to know. Their worlds had collided and nothing would ever be the same again. The evening had fallen softly, like a velvet curtain drawn across the sky. And in the dim quiet of the library that had once been only a monument to his family's legacy, the young heir now felt something shift inside him. What had started as curiosity, the discovery of a hidden letter in an ancient corner of his home, had already taken him further than he ever imagined. He had met her, the girl behind the trembling handwriting, the dreamer who believed that words could change a life. And now, standing on the fragile threshold between admiration and something infinitely deeper, he began to realize that what connected them was no longer just paper, ink, or the accidental path of destiny. It was something far greater, something blossoming silently beyond words. He watched her as she leafed through a worn notebook she always carried, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips curving into an unconscious smile whenever she stumbled across a phrase she loved. There was nothing rehearsed about her, nothing contrived. She was the opposite of the world he had grown up in, a world where appearances were carefully crafted, where conversations were measured, and where affection often came with conditions. She was raw, unpolished, yet radiant, as if life itself had chosen her as its storyteller. And in her presence he felt stripped of the weight of expectation, as though he could, for the first time, simply be himself. It wasn't love at first sight. No, it was something more dangerous, more consuming. It was the gradual recognition that she had already become essential to him, without his permission. Every evening they spent together, every hesitant conversation that melted into laughter, every silence that spoke louder than any words, all of it was weaving an invisible bond between them. And he began to wonder whether this bond had been waiting for centuries, hidden like the letter itself, until the right moment for it to be found. The girl, for her part, tried to resist the pull. She had grown up believing dreams were fragile things, easily shattered if held too tightly. Her writing was the only place where she allowed herself to hope freely, and yet, here was someone who looked at her, as though she herself were a story worth telling. She could not understand why an heir of wealth and privilege would care to linger in her modest world of cramped apartments, second-hand books, and sleepless nights spent over candlelight. But every time she saw the sincerity in his eyes that didn't carry pity but recognition, she found her walls weakening. Still, she feared it. Love, she thought, could be the most dangerous of illusions. It could promise forever and then vanish without explanation. She had written about heartbreak, about lovers separated by chance, by fate, by cruel circumstance. But what she had never written about, what she could barely admit even to herself, was the possibility of a love that healed rather than wounded. To allow herself to believe in that was to risk the one thing she had always tried to protect, her heart. And yet, night after night, she found herself waiting for his knock on the door, or his quiet voice calling her name when they met at the library. The heir, who once carried the air of a man bound by duty, had become a companion, a confidant, and slowly something more. When they sat side by side, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, the silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibilities, of words unspoken, of emotions neither dared to name. There was one evening, more than any other, that seemed to mark the crossing of an invisible boundary. They had gone walking outside the city, where the noise of carriages and streets fell away into fields touched by moonlight. The sky was endless, and for the first time she confessed how terrified she was of never being read, of her words never escaping the pages of her notebooks. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on her with a devotion she did not yet recognize. When she fell silent, embarrassed at having revealed too much, he bent down, picked up a wildflower from the grass, and placed it gently in her hand. "You don't need the world to see you," he said softly, "because I already do." It was such a simple sentence, and yet it broke something inside her. Or perhaps it healed it. She felt her eyes sting, not because of sorrow, but because she realized how long she had been waiting for someone to truly say those words. In that moment, the walls she had built for years began to crumble. She didn't answer him with words, for words suddenly seemed too small. Instead, she leaned into the silence, the kind of silence that carried everything: gratitude, trust, and the fragile beginning of love. From that day forward, their connection deepened. It wasn't always easy. Their worlds were still vastly different, and shadows of doubt still crept in. She would wonder if he could ever truly leave behind the expectations of his family to stand beside her. He would question whether she could ever believe that he loved her for herself and not for the romantic story she represented. But each test only seemed to bind them closer, as though destiny itself were determined not to let them drift apart. The library, once a place of dust and forgotten tomes, became their sanctuary. Among the rows of books they began to craft not just stories, but a life. He read her drafts aloud, his voice trembling when he stumbled upon passages that revealed her hidden fears. She teased him for his seriousness, but secretly cherished that someone valued her words enough to feel them. Sometimes she would fall asleep against his shoulder as candles burned low, and he would sit perfectly still, afraid to wake her, marveling at the quiet miracle of her trust. Their love was not thunderous or dramatic, not the kind of love that demanded to be shouted from rooftops. It was quieter, steadier, blooming like a flower that grew in the cracks of stone, against all odds, yet unshakable. It was a love that existed beyond the pages of her notebooks, beyond the gilded walls of his family estate, beyond the whispers of doubt. It was, at its core, a love beyond words. And though neither dared to name it yet, both knew. They had already begun writing a story together, a story that no letter could have predicted, no ink could have captured, and no future could erase. The seasons began to turn slowly and quietly, marking the passage of time in ways neither of them could ignore. The world around them changed. Leaves burned into gold and crimson. Snow fell silently over the rooftops. Spring stretched green fingers across forgotten fields. Yet within the intimate circle they had built, between the dusty shelves of the library and the quiet corners of her modest home, the rhythm of their lives seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. It was as though they had stepped into a story of their own making, one not dictated by fate or family, but by choice, and the choice, more than anything else, was love. But love, they both knew, was not a fairy tale written in flawless ink. It was messy, unpredictable, and often demanded courage beyond what either felt they possessed. The heir's family had begun to whisper, questions about his absence from formal gatherings, the disapproval etched in their voices when they noticed his attention drifting elsewhere. He had been groomed to inherit responsibility, to marry strategically, to carry on a name older than the stones of their estate. To them, the idea that he might bind himself to a girl of modest birth, a writer with little more than dreams in her pockets, seemed reckless, even foolish. And yet, every time he looked at her, he knew. No amount of tradition could fill the silence she had filled with laughter. No amount of expectation could replace the way she had taught him to breathe differently, more freely. He could never go back to a life without her. She, however, wrestled with doubts of her own. Every page she wrote seemed to echo her fears, that she was a fleeting chapter in his story, not the ending he would one day choose. She watched the way others looked at him, with respect, with envy, with the weight of acknowledgement she could never command. She wondered if she was stealing something from him, if her love would cost him more than he was willing to admit. And in the privacy of her thoughts, she sometimes questioned whether love, no matter how deep, could bridge two worlds that had been built to remain apart. Yet as fragile as those doubts were, they dissolved every time he reached for her hand, because his touch was steady, his gaze was unwavering, and his words, though often few, carried the kind of certainty she had always thought was a fiction reserved for the pages of her novels. One evening, as the last embers of a fire dimmed in the library hearth, he spoke with a gravity that startled her. "I don't want to live in a story where you are only a chapter," he said. His voice was low, but his words seemed to fill the room with an immovable truth. "I want you to be the story, all of it, every page, every ending, every beginning." She froze, her notebook slipping slightly from her fingers. No declaration of love could have touched her more deeply than this, for she had always believed that words shaped destiny, and now his words had reshaped hers. It was as though he had rewritten the narrative she had feared, the one where she was temporary, and offered her instead a future. Still, she tested him gently, her voice trembling. "And what if the world doesn't understand?" He leaned closer, his expression soft yet resolute. "Then let the world misunderstand. It's not their story to tell. It's ours." From that moment, the course of their lives seemed to shift. They began to speak less about fear and more about plans, about books she would publish, stories he would help her carry into the world, places they would travel, memories they would write together in the margins of time. The library became not just a sanctuary, but a workshop of dreams. They cleared a desk where she could write, undisturbed. He searched through shelves for forgotten volumes to inspire her. Together, they brought the dust-covered room back to life, filling it with light, with laughter, with the sound of futures being built. Yet the path forward was not without storms. His family's disapproval grew sharper. Invitations arrived to banquets and gatherings he refused to attend, each absence a louder declaration of rebellion. Rumors circled, painting her as an opportunist, a distraction. She endured the whispers with quiet dignity, though her heart ached each time she saw him bear the burden of defending her. But where others saw scandal, He saw liberation. For the first time in his life, he was not performing a role written for him, he was writing his own. And with every battle he fought for her, their love deepened, no longer fragile but resilient, strengthened by the very opposition that sought to destroy it. There came a day, quiet, unassuming, like most turning points, when he took her hand and led her not to the library, nor to her humble apartment, but to the garden behind the estate. The evening was still, the air scented with roses his ancestors had planted generations ago. And there, beneath the weight of history and expectation, he knelt. Not with a jeweled ring, not with a performance fit for nobility, but with nothing more than honesty in his voice. "I don't need their approval," he said. "I need only yours. Will you write the rest of this life with me?" Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled, a smile that carried every battle, every doubt, every joy they had shared. She knelt with him so that they faced each other as equals and whispered, "Yes, let's write it together." From then on, their love ceased to be a secret whispered in dusty corners. It became a vow, unshakable and alive. Though not everyone welcomed it, their story spread nonetheless. First among friends who admired their courage, then among strangers who found inspiration in the tale of an heir, and a writer who had dared to choose love over convention. And when her first book was finally published, a book he had helped her edit by candlelight, a book that carried within its pages fragments of their journey, it was not just her triumph, it was theirs. The dedication read simply, "For the one who saw me before the world ever did." Readers would never know the full story behind those words, but he did. And every time he opened the book, he felt the same quiet miracle as when he had first discovered her letter in the hidden corner of the library. The miracle of love that had waited patiently to be found. Their future was not perfect, nor was it free of struggle, but it was theirs, written not by obligation nor by chance, but by choice. Each day became a page, each year a chapter, each dream a paragraph carefully woven into the larger tapestry of their lives. They quarreled and reconciled, stumbled and rose again, but always returned to the same truth, that the story they were writing together was the one worth living. And so the heir who had once wandered into a dusty library searching for nothing more than curiosity found instead the love of his life. And the writer, who had once believed her words would never reach beyond her own notebook, discovered that the greatest story she would ever tell was not bound in pages at all. It was the story of them, a future written together, a story without end.